Let's get the show started in, I think, a perfect way, right? We got to bring things sometimes into perspective a little bit, right? We live in this bubble that's in Detroit. A lot of things going on here. You got fish running around the studio like a psycho. But, look, we live in Detroit. This is what we do every day. I don't think anybody is more familiar with the story of Dan Campbell than probably the people in this room right now, right? Fair. Okay. Was he snubbed from the Coach of the Year list with the 5 finalists: Sean McDermott, Doug Peterson, Brian Daboll, Kyle Shanahan, Nick Sirianni? So I'm going to start, and I do think he was snubbed for only one coach, though. I think every coach on there, rightfully so, should be ahead of him outside of one, and that's Sean McDermott. I'm not sure why Sean McDermott and the Buffalo Bills were recognized among one of the coaches of the year. Yes, they were 13-3, but they were expected to win 13 games.
Right.
And they met their expectations. The Philadelphia Eagles expected to compete for the division. They exceeded expectations. Was it 15-2 or 14-3? I believe 14-3.
Yeah, 14-3.
14-3.
And that was after Tyreek Hill left. So.
Well, no, I'm talking about the Eagles.
Oh, yeah.
They exceeded expectations, man.
Yes.
9 wins last year, wild card spot, won their division, won the number 1 seed in the NFC.
I get it, but
they deserve it. I don't care about the roster.
8 or 9 Pro Bowlers.
It doesn't matter.
I get it.
You go put a bad coach on that team, do they win that amount of games?
I don't know.
You don't. You do know, actually.
I don't know.
Because the good coaches win football games and the bad ones lose.
I'll tell you who deserves it, though, Brian Daboll. That's who should win this award.
You're missing the point here. You're missing the point here. Kyle Shanahan, Trey Lance, Jimmy Garoppolo, Brock Purdy won 10 straight. Started 3-4, won 10 straight to end the season with Jimmy Garoppolo and Brock Purdy. That deserves recognition. I don't care how talented the team is. Okay, moving on. Brian Daboll takes over a team that should be picking in the top 2, top 3 right now. Spend no money in the offseason. No wide receivers. A quarterback nobody believes in. Get to the playoffs. Impressive. Doug Peterson takes over an Urban Meyer situation. Disaster. Talent. They spend some money in free agency, get Trevor Lawrence some weapons. He has the greatest jump statistically in passer rating from year 1 to year 2. They win their division, and they make the playoffs. You know all 5 of those coaches that I just mentioned have in common? Peterson, Daboll, McDermott, Sirianni, Kyle Shanahan. What do they all have in common? They made the playoffs.
Yeah, so they all made the playoffs.
So even if I want to give Dan a spot, I think I would give it to McDermott. I would give it to him over McDermott. I think he's more deserving. But the conversation of, well, Brian Daboll started 7-2 and they finished 2-6-1. Well, okay, we're going to punish him for the way his team ended the season, but not punish the Lions for the way they started? You don't get to have it both ways, number one. Number two, Dan didn't make the playoffs among those 5 coaches. Last I checked, you still have to accomplish something. So as much as I do think he got snubbed, and as much as I do think he should be in there over Sean McDermott, at the end of the day, I'm not offended by the list. Those are the 5 best coaches in terms of who deserve the award outside of McDermott. Obviously, you know how I feel about it. But if even Dan Campbell made that list, and let's say he was 5th over McDermott, where would you vote him? 5th. Because I'm not putting a vote for him higher than Daboll, Peterson, Sirianni, Kyle Shanahan. All in their own right accomplished a lot this season.
Mm-hmm. I got 2 coaches that I'm surprised. I would rather have these 2 coaches over Sean McDermott in this conversation. One is Pete Carroll. I think Pete Carroll, if you talk about a coach that was snubbed, he made the playoffs, and he got to the playoffs with Geno Smith. And he had multiple rookies starting on his defense. You lose Jamal Adams early in the year. Personally, I think Pete Carroll should have been there over Sean McDermott. Another one, if we're going by teams that had records like 13 wins, what about the Chiefs? Chiefs won the AFC with no Tyreek. That was the big storyline. How are they going to respond after that? They win 14 games, and you have an MVP on your roster. I get it's Patrick Mahomes, and they're going to get that type of treatment, especially with Andy Reid, where it's like, hey, it's Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes. They do this every year. But if we're talking about storylines and deserving, I mean, what happened with Sean McDermott and the Bills? Like, what adversity did they face other than their quarterback turning the ball over consistently? Like, there was not much there. Now, the DeMar Hamlin situation, but that doesn't mean you get pushed into Coach of the Year. So, 2 coaches for me, I think were snubbed personally. And Dan Campbell, I don't think he was snubbed because you just hit on it. All these coaches made the playoffs, but if we're talking playoffs, personally, I think Pete Carroll and Andy Reid deserve a little more love. But Pete Carroll should be there over Sean McDermott. There's no question. I don't
Pete
get
Carroll over McDermott. Yeah. I don't mind
because what he did with Geno Smith is unbelievable, and they beat the Lions head to head. Like that deserve. I mean, if we're talking Dan Campbell, then Pete Carroll deserves to be in there.
Well, no, if we're talking,
but I think Sean McDermott's the odd one out to me.
You know what? Pete Carroll is a very good name because I can't argue because they were in the tank for Bryce Young conversation going into the season.
Exactly.
I got to be fair. The same way Dable was. And you know what? They did make the playoffs. So if anything, if I'm going to remove McDermott, now that you've brought him up, I don't really have a choice. You know why, Jeff? Because they made the playoffs.
There you go. For going off that.
They made the playoffs.
Yeah.
Dan Campbell didn't. The Lions didn't. As good as they looked down the stretch, you still have to accomplish something to be rewarded. Why should he be a finalist over Nick Sirianni? Give me a reason.
I don't got one for that.
Okay, Kyle Shanahan. You can't.
No.
You can't tell me over Dable. You can't tell me over Peterson, and you couldn't make a case over Pete Carroll.
No, because they lost head to head.
I don't take into consideration head to head.
Well, but also the
saying.
storyline too. Geno Smith, what he did with him, revived his career. But Doug Peterson, I think people probably look at that and say, but I'm not even mad over Doug Peterson. I mean, he won his division. I get you could say, well, he had Trevor Lawrence, but to your point, he didn't look good. Trevor Lawrence wasn't Trevor Lawrence last year. I mean, he had an amazing season. They've improved. They won their division. You could say whatever you want about the division, but the fact is they won their division, and that matters. And if we're talking playoffs, they beat the Chargers. I get it wasn't the prettiest, but still, for taking that into a consideration, they went on a run there. So I think Peterson, I'm not mad about Peterson. The only one I'm a little questionable about is Sean McDermott. I don't really understand.
McDermott doesn't make sense to me because I thought that Bills would win 13 games this year.
And they did.
And they did. Most people did. So they accomplished what they thought they would do. You thought the Bills would be one of the better teams in the AFC. Where's the story? Nobody expected Nick Sirianni and the Eagles to be a number 1 seed this year. Nobody expected Jalen Hurts to be an MVP candidate.
Yeah, true.
Now, you thought he'd be really good as, third year. He would take another step forward like he did the year. But
no,
MVP?
No, I didn't. No.
The team, the way they played, unbelievable on defense. Some of the corners that are now going to go get paid somewhere else. Nick Sirianni deserves to be in that conversation. Kyle Shanahan won 10 straight with Jimmy Garoppolo and Brock Purdy. Hasn't lost a game since, week 8, week 7? Doug Peterson makes the playoffs, wins his division. Brian Dable takes the shitty New York Giants and takes them to the playoffs. Makes Daniel Jones look like a viable option at quarterback.
Didn't even pick up his 5th-year option before the season, and they got him to the playoffs, 9-7, and won.
Pete Carroll, like you mentioned,
made
the playoffs. That kind of matters. So we'll talk more about Dan in the follow-up here, but I look at this list, the only one that didn't make sense was Sean McDermott.
What about Kevin O'Connell?
Doesn't deserve to be there.
Okay, we agree there.
11-0 in one-possession games. Yeah. I don't see Coach of the Year. I see fortunate. I see a bright coach. I see a coach with a lot of potential. But no, you can't be in that conversation over those guys. Kyle Shanahan, by definition, Coach of the Year. Who did the most with what they had? I don't know anybody that could get more out of the Niners than what Kyle Shanahan did with 3 quarterbacks this year. I don't know anybody that can get what they got out of Nick Sirianni in Philly this year. I don't know anybody that would walk into a horrible dumpster rebuild situation in New York, turn them into a playoff team. I don't know who would take over an Urban Meyer situation, toxic culture. Remember, that was the problem here in Detroit. You had a toxic culture from Matt Patricia. Doug Peterson walks in, fixes it in 1 year. They make the playoffs. They win their division. You want to talk to me about Ryan Tannehill getting hurt? That's not the point.
Yeah,
that's all irrelevant. What have you accomplished? Dan, so far, nothing. All the people listed, including Kevin O'Connell, won his division. Come on, give me a break. I've watched Matt LaFleur win 13 games for 3 consecutive years, Jeff. You know how many Coach of the Year awards he has? 0. It's not just about the wins. It's about your story, expectations, what goes into the season. I don't want to hear that. He got snubbed. Like, if anything, you can make the case Pete Carroll got snubbed over.
Yeah, this isn't one of those Detroit versus everybody situations. Like, this is just the reality of they picked coaches that made the playoffs, and there were just coaches that had a little more impressive season than the Lions. Doesn't mean the Lions season wasn't impressive, but to the point I was making, Sean McDermott, okay, if you don't want him there, then who do you want there? I would say Pete Carroll. And that's a completely non-biased statement. Like, he had what he did with that Seahawks team, did not expect it.
The production he got out of his rookies, Kenneth Walker, Tariq Woolen,
yes,
starting 2 rookies on the offensive line, 2 on the defensive line, actually. I mean, come on.
And not to discredit Dan, but I picked this team to win 8 games. They won 9. Like,
I think it's how they finished really resonated with a lot of people, and I agree. And I think it's a big deal how they finish the season. You don't win 8 of 10 on accident. Having said that, do I just forget about the first 7 games of the year where you blew multiple fourth quarter leads? Where you were attempting 4th and 9s on the road against a third-string quarterback? When you attempted an onside kick against the Philadelphia Eagles? When you gave them an extra possession going into half? Or when you had 5 turnovers coming off a bye week against Dallas? And 8 penalties? I don't know. Sorry. I think Dan's a great story. But in a season of many great stories, his isn't one of the better ones. Now, had Seattle lost and the Lions got to the playoffs, he would be on that list.
Or maybe Sean McDermott would. We'd be making an argument he should be.
I think he would get in over McDermott if the Lions made the playoffs, but they didn't. You brought up the 5 on the list. And then who's the one that you're talking about now? Pete Carroll.
Yes.
What do they all have in common?
Made the playoffs.
Made the playoffs.
Yeah.
Tough for me to make a case for Dan Campbell. I just don't see it. I just don't.
Yeah, we agree.
I get it. And I think if you were to vote 6th and 7th, the 2 guys that were just off the list, I think 1 would be Carroll and 2 would be Dan. It'd be very close.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be very close, but I'm sorry. Dan walked into New York and breathed Dable. Adam, quit pumping up Dable. Man, I would love for a head coach to walk in here, make the playoffs or win a playoff game in year 1 in a clear rebuild. Because last year, the coach walked in, went 3-13-1 in a clear rebuild.
And that was in the NFC East.
With 3 teams making the playoffs.
Almost 4.
A 12-5 Cowboys team.
Yeah.
And a 14-3 Philadelphia Eagles team. Playing each of those 2 teams twice a year. That's funny. That's just funny. What are you going to do?